John Davis, Kevin Hoover, Mary Morgan, Wade Hands, Brad Bateman, Steve Medema, Bob Diamond, Margaret Chavez, Morrow, who's this second? Evelyn. All right. So that's a pretty good crowd. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Morning. I'm standing in for Ross Emmett. I've had some emails with Ross recently, and I can tell you he says he's recovering well. So we can all wish him a speedy recovery from his surgery. I'm here to chair the opening plenary session of this conference. We do have some changes. Michael Walker is here to participate. Robert Lawson, unfortunately, had to pull out due to family health emergencies. And Simeon Jankov is going to join us via Zoom, I believe. So I don't know if we can pull Simeon up on the screen. Not quite sure how this. Nope. If we're having trouble bringing him up, then I think we should probably start with Michael. Go ahead with Michael. Yes, okay. So Michael, do you want to come up and give us a maximum of 20 minutes on
20 minutes.
I should
expect me to cover the history of the world in 20 minutes.
I should give you the title, actually, shouldn't I? It's on history of economic freedom indices. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to be here and tell you about something that I'm quite excited about. And I guess as a with a background in econometrics and mathematics, you'd be surprised if I wasn't excited by numbers. The fact that these numbers are some of the most crucial measurements that we ever make makes them even more fascinating. I want to tell you in the time I have, and I hope I can get it done in 20 minutes, the story of the development of what I think is the premier measurement of economic freedom in the world, the Index of Economic Freedom. There has been a copy of that made by another organization, which I think is inferior to the Fraser Institute measurement. And the Fraser Institute measurement, which has been used in more than 5,800 papers, academic papers, I think gives it the lead as being the reliable academic measurement of economic freedom. Well, the current index is the culmination of a process which began at the 1984 meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society in Cambridge, England. In the course of a comment on a paper by Paul Johnson, I made reference to the famous passage in Capitalism and Freedom, written by Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman, in which the authors note, historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relation between political freedom and free markets. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. So this was Milton and Rose making the comment about the importance of markets to political freedom. Well, there then ensued a discussion about the relationship between economic and political freedom led by the late Max Turn. And it became clear during the discussion that while Milton and Rose's comment had been extant for about 30 years, there had been no attempt to explore empirically or academically the relationship between economic and political freedoms in a scholarly way. So at the meeting, I approached Milton and Rose Friedman and invited them to co-host a symposium to investigate the relationships, and they agreed. And subsequently, Neil MacLeod at the Liberty Fund agreed to provide the funding for a group of distinguished economists from all over the world to meet at the Napa Valley in 1986. The proceedings of this first symposium were published in a book which I edited entitled Freedom, Democracy, and Economic Welfare, published by the Fraser Institute in 1988. Meanwhile, Alvin Rybushka, Milton Friedman's colleague at the Hoover Institution, who had been concerned about these issues for nearly a decade because of his direct involvement in the study and documentation of the economic development of Hong Kong, held a series of Liberty Fund conferences. One on taxation and liberty was held in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1985. Another on taxation, democracy, and threats to liberty in Savannah, Georgia in 1987. And Alvin was also a participant in the Napa Valley Conference, which I have just mentioned, and was to play a key role in developing the symposium series that we were going to bring people from all over the world to sort of wrestle with this issue of measuring economic freedom. Milton Friedman has suggested to me that I should invite to the first meeting in Napa Valley a representative from Freedom House, because they had expanded their 1982 annual report on political and civil liberties around the world to include, on an experimental basis, ratings for economic freedom. Raymond Gastel, then the president of Freedom House, and Lindsay Wright, a young economist working for the organization, came and presented a paper on their findings on economic freedom at the first conference. As Gastel and Wright shared their views on economic liberty, it was obvious that they differed significantly from most conference participants. And this is very important. The Gastel and Wright approach reflected the Freedom House perspective that democratic political procedures and civil liberties were the most important aspects of freedom. According to this philosophy, highly progressive taxation and large income transfers are entirely consistent with individual liberty if only the policy areas are approved by democratic majorities of a legislative body. I can remember Raymond Gastel saying to Raymond Gastel that I would propose a T-shirt for his organization, and the T-shirt would have on the front, "Political might makes right." In other words, if you had the political majority, then whatever you did was right. And well, he didn't go for the T-shirt idea. Several of the participants in this first conference, including myself, Walter Block, and Alvin Rybushka, believed the Freedom House approach trivialized and distorted economic freedom, making it dependent on the political process. We remembered, Walter and I pointed out at one moment that, remember that the Nazis were duly elected and immensely admired. And you have to always remember that political appeal and political popularity doesn't mean anything in terms of its capacity to produce freedom. In fact, often the opposite. So we came away even more convinced from with this meeting that the development of a sound measure of economic freedom was a vitally important project, because only with measurements of economic freedom could we demonstrate its importance in this contest between political and economic freedom. My colleague Walter Block and Alvin Rabushka had a subsequent meeting in which they decided to suggest that a series of follow-up symposia be held in order to explore the weaknesses of the Freedom House approach and to develop an index of economic freedom that was consistent with the history and proper meaning of economic liberty. The long-term objective would be to develop a measure of economic freedom that could be published on a regular basis, like the Freedom House's annual survey of political and civil liberties. It was then left for me to persuade Milton and Rose Friedman to co-host the series of symposia, to properly elucidate the subject, and to persuade the Liberty Fund to provide the financing. Of course, the reason why, if you're organizing a conference, if you want to get the best people, you just got to get one or two good people, right? You got to get the stars, and then everybody else will want to come. So I knew if I could get Milton and Rose to come, I could get the pick of the crop. And that was exactly what happened. The new president of the Liberty Fund, W.W. Hill, was quite excited by the project, could see its implications, and happily agreed to fund the further 5 meetings in which international experts would build up an intellectual base from which the index might be formed. The second set of conferences held in Vancouver in July of 1988 and centered on a paper presented by Alvin Rabushka on how economic freedom should be defined. Remember, we were I remember how primitive our ideas were, because nobody had given serious thought to what in an empirical scientific way was economic freedom. Anyway, so Alvin's work, based on building on the work of John Locke, Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, Murray Rothbard, and his own extensive empirical and theoretical analysis. And Rabushka examined the attributes of economic freedom and the nature of policies consistent with that freedom. He argued that private property and the rule of law provided the foundation, the institutional basis for economic freedom. Rabushka applied the concept of economic freedom to 5 basic areas: taxation, public spending, economic regulation of business and labor, money and foreign trade, and outlined some ideas about how it might be measured in each of these areas. It was really pioneer stuff. Nobody ever tried to do this before, and it was really fascinating to be around, particularly Alvin Rabushka. This work proved to be quite important in focusing subsequent discussions at the other symposia. Also, at the second meeting came the first attempt to provide empirical measures with a paper by Zane Spindler and Laurie Still. In their paper, they added to the taxonomy suggested by Alvin Rabushka and provided a first cut try at evaluating the Freedom House Index, which was a political freedom index, and provided a first cut try at evaluating their index and adding to it a measure of freedom based on involuntary military service and freedom of foreign trade and investment. One of the consequences of the discussion of this paper was the suggestion that all of the participants produce a list of factors that they felt should go into an index of economic freedom. I mean, now you say, well, that must have been easy. I mean, having the benefit of what ensued. But so, and there resulted from that call a list of indicators that might be used for the purpose. The third meeting was held in Banff, 1989. You notice we meet in all these terrible places, but somebody had to do it. You know what I mean? And the third meeting represented the first real attempt to construct both theoretical and empirical measures, which are derived from the principles sketched out by Rabushka at the second session. Sectoral papers explored the construction of indices for labor markets, international trade, and money markets. The discussions were most interesting for the direction they would provide for the papers presented at the fourth meeting at Sea Ranch in California, another terrible place. In 1990, Sea Ranch was where Milton and Rose's house was, so it was easy for them to attend, easier for them to attend. Well, the fourth symposium saw the investigation proceed to a much higher level of understanding, both empirically and theoretically. theoretical paper by Ron Jones and Alan Stockman, built on 2 papers by Stephen Easton, to specifically consider freedom as part of the standard economic model. The first time this had been done. Their analysis put to rest the confusion which often attends such discussions, and that is the difference. And the difference that they raised was between wealth and freedom. They showed that there could simultaneously be a reduction in freedom and an increase in wealth. And this was a big move, because before that, people had been using wealth and freedom interchangeably in this kind of work. Also at the 4th symposium, there was the beginning of the index, which anticipated much of what was to follow, with Robert Block and Robert Lawson producing the first comprehensive index, which ranked 79 countries in the sectors which Bushka had outlined and which were further discussed at the 3rd symposium. The 4th symposium also involved, in a paper by Zane Spindler and Joanna Miyake, the consideration of a list of indices of freedom which had been devised during the 2nd symposium. One of the most interesting aspects of the 4th symposium was a survey of economic freedom conducted by Milton and Rose Friedman. Each of the symposium participants was asked to rank 11 countries, which would be familiar to all participants. Milton and Rose then analyzed the rankings during the evening and presented the following day. This simple survey and analysis of it proved to be quite helpful in discovering the dispersion of estimates of the freedom of countries that were neither very free nor very unfree, but somewhere in between. The classic problem of distinguishing amongst things that are similar was also seen to plague the task of measuring freedom. You get the point I'm making here. I don't know if anybody's still awake here. That we are listening. So the point was that this little exercise revealed the difficulty of even very smart and well-informed and locked-in people of having the same vision or the same view of what it was that they were measuring. So the dispersion in the views of these people ranking those 11 countries was a kind of a wake-up call for our whole exercise. So one of the conclusions that emerged from the Sea Ranch meeting was that there were 2 ways in which to construct an index of freedom: the low-tech and judgmental way, in which a number of individuals are asked to provide their subjective ranking of a group of countries, and the high-tech way, in which a large number of criteria based on a series of measurable quantities are applied to produce the rating. So you get the difference here. One is you're going to use objective measurement of things. On the other hand, you're going to ask people about their opinions. And I must tell you, after this exercise, whenever I see somebody doing an opinion survey and they say X, I think, oh my gosh, if people ever knew how hopelessly terrible that is a way of arriving at any kind of knowledge. So by way of further testing the low-tech approach, it was decided to have we didn't want to give up on it, you see. It was decided to have a future meeting, consider a group of countries, and to have individuals who were familiar with the countries, rank them on a freedom scale. The 5th symposium, held in 1991 in Monterey, California, focused on a series of papers which had been constructed in this way. In other words, giving one more chance for this non-empirical asking opinions kind of approach. Essentially, groups of respondents in Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe, and North America were asked to rank countries in their region, as well as countries outside their region, which were common to all of the lists. And that was the key thing, that we thought maybe the problem was in the first go around that there wasn't a reference group. But if you gave people a reference group of key countries and asked them to compare their country to that, we would get better results. While this exercise produced some interesting insights, in general, it was found the respondents did not possess enough information about the countries they were asked to rank and it was quite difficult to find people in a given region who were knowledgeable about more than one or two countries. While there are many interesting insights generated from the various regions, it did not prove possible to derive a coherent index from the components. In a separate survey conducted by Stephen Easton and myself, members of the Mont Pelerin Society, does everybody know what the Mont Pelerin Society is? The society created by Hayek and Friedman well, you all know what it is. Anyway, so this is a group, you know, which if you're going to be able to do anything by having a survey of people like that, this group should be it should really work, right? So we gave this task, myself and Steve Easton gave the Mont Pelerin Society members the task of ranking countries in their region. And this survey did prove to be coherent. However, in general, it was felt that more success might be achieved by reverting to the high-tech method. This is an academic way of saying it was really a flop, but we had put so much effort into it, we had to say it was worthwhile. So that we would revert to the high-tech method and use the many index series for each country, which Gortney, Block, and Lawson had begun in the fourth session. This objectification of the measurement process, where you actually measure stuff in the countries, objectification of the measurement process would overcome the problem of subjectivity and the difficulty of finding knowledgeable people to do the rating. However, a serious problem remained, namely to find the weights that should be attached to the various data series in the Gortney, Block, and Lawson index. In partial response to the recognition of this problem, Easton and I undertook another survey of the Mont Pelerin Society members, in which we asked respondents to rank each country's performance in a number of general areas such as international trade, monetary freedom, etc., to get an idea of the weights. The sixth symposium focused entirely on the revised Gortney, Block, and Lawson paper and the second paper which Easton and I had constructed. The sixth symposium was held in the Sonoma Valley, California, another terrible place to go, in 1993, and the focus of discussion was a greatly revised Gortney, Block, and Lawson paper, and the paper and Easton and I had written to report the results of our second survey. Many suggestions for improvements were advanced, and a number of approaches to the problem of weighting the composite index were discussed. The Index of Economic Freedom, which is now published by the Fraser Institute, reflects the valuable contribution of all of these participants toward resolving the difficulties which were identified. All told, 61 people have contributed to the Rating Economic Freedom program of the Fraser Institute. Well, as we were in this careful academic process of sorting out the, as one of my friends says, the fly shit from the pepper, very unfortunate reference to our research, but in any event, as we were doing all this careful sorting, the Heritage Foundation of Washington published an Index of Economic Freedom. There was some question, therefore, as to why we should produce another, because we were just on the verge of, it would assemble all the appropriate things. Now we were just about to perform the final alchemy, and here comes Heritage. You know, Ed Fulner was a guy who recognized a good idea when he saw one, and he came to one of our programs, and as Milton said, he stole our idea. And Ed was not subject to the same kind of constraints we academics were to do everything this way and that way. And so he went ahead and published his index, which was fine. I mean, I wish there were 500 freedom indexes being produced around the world, frankly. But at that moment, we felt a bit vexed at Ed for doing that. And there was the question of whether we should go ahead because Ed had produced this other index. Well, we decided to go ahead, and the reasons are simple. First of all, as the Heritage Foundation was careful to note in their publication, the research which had been produced by the Rating Economic Freedom Project of the Fraser Institute is of a fundamental kind and attempts to deal with the key methodological issues involved in the creation of such an index. And we had to publish that and get it out so that people would recognize what are the key kinds of problems that emerge when you're trying to measure economic freedom. The Heritage Foundation Index reflected some of this research, but is not as complete or comprehensive in that regard as the Fraser Institute Index. And finally, we really believe, and I think probably the profession believes that the number of citations to our index, I don't know what number, I think I mentioned the number before, but I've got it written down here, 15,282 citations. I don't know of another particular measurement that gets that kind of pickup in the academic literature. 15,282 in the last 11 years to the Economic Freedom Index. And I think that in itself is validation enough for me that we needed to do it. We needed to do this index, not the other index, not just allow the other index to go, because academics want to feel that what they're using, their research tools are using, has a pedigree that they can trace right back to the roots. Now there's one key feature, and this is a very important thing for all of us who are engaged in policy work in particular. There's one key difference between the Fraser Institute Index and any of the other indexes of freedom or related things that we have seen. And that is that our index is 100% data-based. There are no opinions in the index. There's the data which the user can track right back to its original source. And so that if you are put in the position of trying to, if you're in country, we're ranking, all of the countries of the world, don't forget, are being ranked in this index. And so if you're in Timbuktu trying to persuade a minister that he should change his view of a particular thing, and you're saying it is the opinion of this pissant organization in Vancouver, British Columbia, that you should do it, that's one thing. If you say, minister, these are the data, that this is how our country compares to all of our competitor countries. And if we change this tariff rate and we change that, we'll be better than them. We'll be more attractive. We'll get more dough in so you can steal more. I mean, no, so we'll get more economic development. And so at a very practical level, the fact that our index is completely data-based gives it much more power as a tool for those of our friends around the world who are trying to change the world. Don't forget, that's what we're all trying to do, right? We're trying to change the world to make it more economically sensible and reliance on the kind of policies that we believe are better. So and so that the ultimate argument for our index is that it is more persuasive, particularly for people who don't believe and have to be shown and have to be persuaded that when they compare their country to some other country that they know, and you can show them the differences, the parallel policies, and you can show the differences in the successful country and the unsuccessful country. It's very powerful in getting the changes that you want to have made. Well, that's all I have to say, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that Bob Lawson chickened out. But of course, Bob, this has been a wonderful partnership with Bob and Jim. The Economic Freedom Project of the Institute has been going on for 30 years, and they are the stars. They are the ones who put in the huge amount of effort that was necessary, both to work with us to do the kinds of measurements that we had been doing in a small way, and this annual report, which they produce now, is gets around the world. I mean, there are other reports. There's a report produced by an organization here in the United States that is something of the same kind, but it hasn't based on the same kind of data approach that we use. And frankly, there are lots of countries that and I don't mean to be parochial here, but there are a lot of countries who find it easier to take advice coming from a country like Canada than from a country than something coming from the United States, which they find to be hegemonic and other stupid things, because there's not much difference in our two indices. But our index, we know from tracking its use around the world, is used particularly in a lot of smaller countries and places where they feel more comfortable dealing with those cuddly Canadians. Anyway, that's the story of the index. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you. Yeah, we should put the people who want the question, put them on the Zoom too, right? Can you do that? What about their pictures? How are you going to get their pictures on the Zoom? Their time for fame. Okay, let's get the first question going. So I think you had your hand up first, sir, in the black sweater. Oh, you want to wait for the microphone? How's your arm? Chuck it over to him.
I have a microphone here. Is this working? Yes.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to ask.
Yeah, the black shirted chap right there.
Okay.
Yeah. The black shirts have it.
So I'm curious, like one nice thing I think about the index is even someone who does not support economic freedom could theoretically agree with the index. Like you could imagine a socialist or interventionist saying, I think that a country with a lower score should have more GDP. So I'm curious, in the crafting of the index, were there any, or either during the crafting or shortly after, were there any statists, interventionists, socialists, whatever, broadly speaking, who actually helped, support the index, just having a different conception of what the correlation would turn out to be?
Well, we had a very broad. We had meetings. My memory fails me, but we had meetings all over Europe and different parts, and we had people from the former. You see, this goes back 30 years now. So we had people come from the former Soviet Union who would raise issues of that kind and talk about, how this or that was wrong and so on. And we had it was not an easy concept to get people to accept that you could even you have to think about it, that how can you measure freedom? Well, we said, well, that's a good point, but we can measure the antecedents to freedom, or we can measure freedom in a negative way. We can measure the effort that people make to take freedom away. And the people who make less effort, the governments that take less effort to take freedom away have have more freedom, because that's basically, it was a long struggle. We had a lot of meetings, we had a lot of discussions, we were careful to include our critics. We always at the Institute bring in the critics because they're free. I mean, tell you, instead of having to do all that thinking yourself about what the problems might be, they tell you what they think the problems are, and then you have your agenda made up for you. Yeah. So that's been part of our strategy, right? And of course, in the beginning, we had to do it so that there would be fewer bombs. Now you think I'm joking when I say that, right? But I knew that the day I realized how important the work of the Fraser Institute in Canada was, and this is going back a long time, 1974, 75, was the day that our critics put a bomb in the elevator and sent the elevator up to our floor, and it burned down the whole elevator and destroyed our reception area. That told me that they did me a huge favor, because I was trying to explain to business people and to others who would support us, foundation, everything, how important this work was. Now I could show them the pictures. How important is this work? It's so important that people don't want us to be able to speak about these issues. So yeah, I'd have forgotten what your question was now, but it was a good chance for me to tell that little story. And you never, and you do. It's, you know, when you're teaching ideas, this is your whole business is teaching ideas. You need to tell your students how important ideas are. They got to come away with, from every one of your classes, realizing that this is the most important kind of stuff. It's boring as hell sometimes, but the work that you have to do to understand how this economy thing works and the ideas that are fundamental to it are very, very important. And our enemies know it. That was the, you know, so I could show them the pictures of the burned out elevator and say, you think they're not important? Well, I tell you what, the people who are voting for the New Democratic Party, imagine the leftist party called the New Democratic Party, bunch of fascist, socialist miscreants. But they call their party the New Democratic Party. We're going to have a new kind of democracy where you will have a king and you don't have to worry about, you know. Anyway, so I wax eloquent, but not really very. What's the next question? Yes.
Okay, I'd like to know more about the Ed Fulner's heritage. Stealing of your ideas was kind of the way that you portrayed it.
Milton said that. I didn't say that.
Okay.
Milton was a key part of the whole program. Milton and Rose were my friends, and they were the key part of the thing. And I don't. You know what? You know my response. You know what my response to that was. By the way, I didn't. My response to that was, Milton, don't be silly. We need 1,000 freedom indexes being produced. This is wonderful that Ed thinks this is a good idea and put all his resources into doing an index.
So Ed is at the time that you said in your story that some of the initial discussions took place at the Mont Pelerin Society meetings, and then it took a number of years, and then your thing was developed. And during this time, Ed was secretary treasurer, right, of the Mont Pelerin Society?
He was, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm trying to figure out what Ed thought he was doing. Did he think of himself as well? Maybe these guys are not developing this important idea quickly enough, or
No, he was
just seeing that it was a good idea and that heritage should also have some.
Well, he did what I hope people would do. He thought it was a good idea and he picked it up and he ran with it. Now we have the Germans who do the same thing. We have all kinds of people around the world who do these kinds of who are thinking along those lines and producing the kind. But when Milton said, Ed stole your idea, you know what I said to him? I said, Milton, I hope 1,000 people will steal the idea. Because that's the only way in which we're going to change the world. We got to get everybody talking about this idea. And Ed has got a lot more resources than I have. So maybe he'll get a lot more people talking about it. No, so Ed Fulner was a good friend then. And he was, I think, it was a good influence for me actually, because he had more resources and he could winkle out things that I didn't have the resources to do, you know. So no, I did not take that view at all. I mean, if you're, you know, I understood Milton's point that it was private, it was sort of intellectual property. In his view, it was like Ed stole our intellectual property, which Milton and I have worked on together. But that is not the attitude you have to take. You don't want to have a proprietarial view when you're trying to change the world in an idea that is profoundly important. You need to have here, steal some more. See what I mean? So, yeah, no, I've never, ever felt that way. I think our index is better. And the academic, I mentioned a number of thousands of citations. Most of those are to the Fraser Institute Index, because academics like to be able to track. They want to know where the stuff comes from. And our stuff being all data-based, they're able to, first of all, insert it in their own data applications, knowing exactly what they're using. Whereas the heritage, I don't know what they're doing now, but originally it was based on, you know, some empirics and some sort of opinions, you know, that kind of thing. And so, as I say, the academic literature speaks pretty clearly about that topic. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm coming.
Thank you. So I certainly have strong sympathies for minimizing the role of subjective judgments in creating such an index, but I wonder whether you not overstate slightly the objectivity. So, I mean, at the very least, you have to make judgments about the quality of the data, especially about the comparability of the data between countries. Could you speak a bit to in what way you reflect or think about those problems?
Well, of course, perfection is going to only be achieved in heaven. And we always have, you know, as my background as an econometrician, and learned very early on. I was very lucky. I've been very lucky in my life. I was a econometrician working away building an econometric model at the university, and I got a call one day from the central bank, and the central bank said, the guys at the central bank, now they had a whole team of people working on this. They had a problem getting their model to converge. You know what that means? But if you're trying to solve a 300 equation model, you have to get the thing to converge. It has to come down to a single solution. And I had figured out how to do that. And so well, I realized, I mean, sorry, what was your question again? I wandered off, I went off down a different branch. What was your question?
Quality and especially comparability of data.
Oh, yes, comparability data. No, that's what led me down. Because one of the problems is that you're talking about a fundamental measurement problem. And that's why I mentioned the fact about measurement and about the problems of dealing with data in general. So in the case of that model, we're trying to get the model to converge on a single solution. And when you're trying to measure something as complex as the economy, you're trying to make different measurements of it, and you're trying to converge on an estimate. And it's no different. The problem of getting a model of 400 equations to converge on a solution and getting to take think of the economy as kind of like a cloud, and there's bits and pieces and all that. And now you're going to try to characterize the cloud. It's the cloud of industrial spending on hose. You see, it's a much more complex conceptually, and in reality, it's a much more complex issue than many people realize. But who was it said that you got to break eggs before you can make a cake or something like that? Or no, you can't without, you must have, now what's that? That's not the expression. What's the expression that you can't make such and such without, omelet. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, right? So, you know, you got to somehow get the stuff. You can't make a comment about the economy until you get some stuff about the economy. And I can tell you stories about data that got published that was, as a statistician, people think that statisticians are, you know, the econometricians are kind of doers. We have a wonderful life, all of our own, of humor about numbers. And I could tell you that some of the stories of the numbers that got published that were trans columns that were had nothing whatever to do with this, and published for years because somebody made a mistake in where the column was. So you always have to be skeptical, and you always have to take parallax. You don't ever take this point of view. Use parallax. Use different ways of looking at something. And when you find that there are conflicts of things that should be coherent, then that's your clue that maybe one or other of these pieces of data are not accurate. And always have that skepticism. Don't forget that the data gathering is done by the lowest level of employee, usually in the organization. And so you always have to worry about the quality of the data. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I forget that you need to. Sorry? You do, so I don't think you needed that thing, you know.
Thank you so much for this fascinating history. I have a similar question about objectivity, so I thought I would just jump in here. So the part where you talked about the discussion, one of the earlier discussions about how to define empirically and scientifically what economic freedom was and how difficult of a discussion that was. I think that's such an interesting question, right? And I'm wondering what the answer would be if a question like that were posed to like a single mother who's poor and struggling in a big city, or someone living on like an Indian reservation, or someone like a struggling Midwestern farmer. And so I guess my question is, who was involved in that discussion of deciding what economic freedom is and how to measure it? And were there people, was it Americans? So I'm curious who that group was.
Well, we had participants from literally all over the world. I had the wonderful what I mean is I had the wonderful gift of having Milton and Rose as my lodestone. I could get whoever I wanted to come to the meetings. I held a meeting in Timbuktu. I could have, Milton. Well, we had sort of a travelogue program. Milton and I, Rose and I decided where we were going to go, and then we would hold a meeting there to justify it and bring people in and have chats. And so now, but your question is, there's something hidden in your question here, which I think I need to probably clarify. You see, what you're asking is, how do you identify the absence of freedom, right? And so we can't, freedom is not something that you can measure, but you can measure the activities of people to deprive people of freedom, right? We can see what are the impediments to freedom. Now, you might say, well, that's a very unsatisfactory way of getting at it. Well, it's the only way of getting at it, frankly, because freedom is, but the efforts that people make to stop you from doing X, if it's construction, the regulations that apply to you as a builder, that what you may and you may not do. Are there 25 regulations or 400? If there are 400 regulations and they're enforced, you know that there's much less freedom in that construction industry than there is in one. There's 25 rules and they're laxly enforced. So we have to measure the activities of people to deprive people of freedom. And that is how we come to our measurement of relative measuring between jurisdictions, because it's all a relative measurement, right? And we're not pretending here that we have an absolute measurement of freedom. But we can tell you to a very, and we can tell by the reaction of the people who live in the countries. When people get our index and we go and have a meeting with people, they say, well, you sure nailed us, because I live here and I do, and I buy my business and all this kind of stuff. And this is what we actually face. So that's, we, over that 30-something year period of digging around, we're pretty confident that what we're actually showing people is pretty close to what is actually the case.
Thank you for your talk. My question is actually kind of similar to some of the ones that came before, so it builds on that. I use the index in teaching, I show it to my students and bring it up on the screen, and we'll talk about it. So I'm a big fan of the empirical approach and the project overall. Sometimes students will be questioning things like Sweden having a low score because it has a big government. And so we're Scandinavian countries like that. And so I guess my question is about culture and psychology, because you could say, well, the people in Scandinavia might not feel that they're unfree in this. They might actually be quite supportive of these measures. So yeah, how does culture and psychology play into that? I know that's subjective, but that would seem to me to be a thing.
Well, that's a very good point. And as you might imagine, my Swedish friends were quick to point this out to me. But the fact that people have different tastes about how much freedom they want doesn't mean that they have more freedom. Do you see what I mean? If people feel more comfortable caged, they really don't want the outside world, they don't want people touching them, and I guess they'd rather be in a cage. Well, they're still in a cage. And so how people feel about is not what we're trying to measure. We're trying to measure the constraints that are imposed on people by the government. And you're absolutely correct that the Swedes have a higher taste for I've spent a lot of time in Sweden, and the people regard the government as part of their family. That's the best way to put it. It's like an old uncle who's trying to help you out because it's good for you, rather than. Now, that's not true of all Swedes. I mean, we have some as you know, in our movement internationally, we have a lot of radical Swedes who think that this is outrageous. But you cannot allow the tastes of people for being in cages to influence your measurement of whether there are cages or not, right? So we measure Sweden, we measure all the countries on a similar basis. And Sweden, we find to have relatively low level of economic freedom. But that if people's tastes are for regulation, we can't do much about that. This is Ladies' Day at the all. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Is this working? Okay.
Yes, but you'll have to speak up a bit. I'm a bit deaf.
Thank you for your talk. I guess one of the answers to Ivanka's question, who is just in front of us, was, there's a definition of freedom to do things as opposed to a definition of freedom from. So when I think, for instance, of the foundation of the welfare state in Britain, it was framed as freedom from those things. And I think that's an important distinction. There are different kind of indexes, and perhaps there's room, they're measuring something different. But my question is about the weights you give, because as far as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong, but the weights you're using to make the index is that all of the categories you're measuring, you're giving equal weights to. Now, if you change the weights, you get very different rankings. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned something about the choice of weights, but you didn't continue that point about how you decided to make these equal weights, because that's a really critical part of any index number recipe, right? Because if you change them radically, the country's order will also radically change. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess ultimately it comes down to using a template, recognizing that the template is not going to be perfect in every case, but that has greater clarity than using a template through which you've punched a bunch of holes in this case and not in that case. In this case, you see what I mean? So we apply it uniformly, and partly because we gave up with the weighting scheme. We really could not sort out how we would do that. So we're applying exactly the same structure to all of the countries, and then let people say, well, we deserve special consideration because of this or that or something else, and then let the people of the country decide whether that's an argument that they go for or not. I mean, we're about trying to get change, and by showing that a person's country is ranked in the 50th percentile, we're hopeful that will cause people to say, well, what the hell is going on? Now, if the people look at all of that and they say, well, you know what, you're wrong, because we have this and that and the other thing going on here, and we don't agree with your ranking. Well, that's fine. We don't find that happen very often, however. We don't get many letters saying, you've aside from premiers and prime ministers, other people who are very upset because they lost an election because of it or whatever. But we generally speaking, and we have to ultimately rely on that feedback. We don't get. In fact, we do get some of the opposite. we get with some people saying, yeah, well, you know, the truth is that we have a different perception, but it's wrong. We need you to tell us that we're better thinking about this and so on is wrong, that the importance of this or that is should be weighted differently or whatever. No, we're about establishing measurements that are done in the same way across as much as carefully and as much as we can, explaining the behavior, the situation in each country. Your point is a very good one. I mean, there are all kinds of, I tell you, over the years, the 30 years or so we've been hammering around with this. There is no question that there are good reasons for wanting to do weighting and all that kind of thing. But you know, we're trying to rank a lot of countries and a lot of different kind of situations. And then so how do you we ultimately gave up on it. We don't weight them in that sense anymore. We don't try to make different calculations. Don't weight them in a let's say pejorative way, if I can put it that way.
Not a pejorative way. The principle of making an index number requires you to have all the indicators in the same value terms or percentage across them. And then it requires you to also weight them according to some characterization of what the overall notion of freedom is. So we think about the retail price index, and that has both those characteristics of equal units in the same value system, and we rank them according to the shopping basket of people's buying. So the weighting depends on the relationship with the economic sort of aspect of this. Now,
You know, what I would suggest is you go into the index. Oh, sure, of course you can, yeah.
It's actually rather like the HDI, the Human Development Index, and Human Development Index, which also has equal weights. And there's a famous quote from, I think, Amartya Sen, who said, well, it's entirely arbitrary. I just want to get the stuff on the agenda and make people think about it. I think that's right, and that's fine. I just wanted to clarify.
Yes,
It's the same kind of way.
yes. Direct. Thank you for clarifying my point of view.
Thanks. I think we're out of time now. It's 10:15, so I want everyone to thank Michael very much for taking the whole session on his shoulders. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about economic freedom, my favorite subject.